None has built up a more prodigious and diverse body of work than Elvis Costello. An unquestioned and uncompromising original, he could hardly be called a consistent hitmaker, but in a career spanning 15 years and as many albums, he's always gripped the imagination of a discerning minority, intrigued by his sharp, literate, enigmatic records and his truculent stance. Over the next 4 weeks, we'll be investigating his life and work with the help of friends, colleagues, and Elvis himself.
A lot of punk has that sort of slightly fascistic sound to it, you know. Dun, 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 dun. It really gets in your face. And that's all we did was just, but the songs just had a bit more tune.
Jake Riviera was extremely excited and said, oh, this guy, you know, that geeky Specs guy, you know, has just been in and this kid's got something.
It seemed to be a pretty good balance of ages and experience and inexperience and naivety and cynicism, you know.
It was all like a whirlwind, you know. Come in and hear it. It's fantastic. You know, great. And he looks through the window and he's waving his arms in the air, you know.
Raised in West London, Elvis Costello, or Declan McManus as he was then, was surrounded by music from the day he was born, in August 1954. His parents recollect that even before he could talk, the squawking, inquisitive only child could invariably be subdued not by toys, but by the soothing strains of Frank Sinatra. His mother, Lillian, managed the records department in Selfridges, and his father, Ross McManus, was a featured vocalist in one of the country's leading dance bands, the Joe Loss Orchestra.
Over the years, Joe Loss dance band, which was on the Glenn Miller model, sort of outlasted its time amazingly, where lots of other bands went to the wall or stayed playing rather kind of nostalgic music. They always moved with the times in a peculiar way. They always absorbed whatever the pop music of the day was. So by the time I became aware of it in the early 60s, they were actually synthesizing the beat group music and arranging it for big bands, quite often in a really anomalous way, you know, and the singers were allotted the various tunes of the day. So my first exposure to singles was having these demonstration records passed on to me by my dad. I mean, some of these things actually are very valuable because I have things like A labels, EMI A labels on vinyl, and even Dick James acetates of various Northern songs, things, sometimes Beatles, sometimes other people, and those sort of things. I mean, the Beatles ones particularly I made a point of keeping because I was so interested in them. And obviously once I became aware of the process, I used to really hope that he got allotted my favourite record as it came out, because sooner or later the single would come my way. So I was very lucky that way. You see, I had access to, you know, far more records than pocket money would have afforded me. It was Please Please Me. And then I think I got With the Beatles for a Christmas present. And I think like the first EP I bought was like Fame at Last by Georgie Fame, I think maybe. Occasionally I'll find like a little cache of magazines but all that stuff, I think, you know, all the childish stuff of music, you know, was very exciting. I suppose, really, you know, you graduate from having toy guns to having toy guitars, which heaven knows a lot healthier, and make guitars out of cardboard boxes, you know, like, you know, you draw pictures of guitars and, you know, all that sort of stuff.
So even before secondary school, his formal education was losing out to the excitement of pop music.
Friday lunchtimes during the holidays were something that I really looked forward to because they used to do a broadcast. There used to be something called the Joe Loss Pop Show, which ran for quite a long time. And as the 60s wore on, they started to actually have guest artists on it. So I used to get to see bands rehearse. You know, we used to get there at 9 in the morning, be there the whole day. The show would go, I think, at 1 o'clock. So I'd watch the orchestra rehearse, and my dad go through the numbers and the other singers, and then the Hollies would turn up, or Billy J. Kramer, or Engelbert Humperdinck, or whoever it was. I mean, it was potluck, of course, you know. I always used to hope it was the Mersey Beats and not Solomon King, you know.
When his parents split up, Elvis moved to Birkenhead with his mother, but the rock scene on Merseyside was all but dead, milked dry during the 60s boom. Nevertheless, music was all he wanted to do.
I decided when I was about 17 that I wanted to do it. And you know, you're much more idealistic about it, and you believe that you cannot see commercial concerns, and you're also, I think at that age, at least I was, very kind of precious about it, you know, and it wasn't going to be tainted by anything as vulgar as electric guitars. Even at one point, I remember, you know, I was dead against electric guitars. Then I went all on them, you know, and like I was in a group which went from a 4-piece to a 2-piece, and then, you know, by now you're talking about 71, 72, and people are saying, no, you got to play Slade songs, and we're standing there with 2 acoustic guitars, and they want to hear "Come On and Feel the Noise," you know. So we're, otherwise we're in Widnes or somewhere where if you don't play Come On and Feel the Noise, they fill you in, like. That's how I learned to sing so loud. It was mainly singing over disinterested people. It was just to stun them to be silent, because I could sing louder than they could talk.
Bleak evenings in hostile pubs and wasted days in a tedious bank job convinced Elvis to return south. He arrived in 1973 at a time when the backrooms and cellars of London pubs like the Tally Ho, the Hope and Anchor, and the Nashville were rocking to a good time blend of country, soul, and R&B, played by groups like Brinsley Schwartz. It was on this pub rock circuit that he began to run into people with similar musical tastes.
A group of us got a house together, and quite by accident, it happened that enough of us were the different instrumentalists to form a group. So we had a little group for a couple of years, which was on the periphery of the dying embers of the pub scene, So we used to get, we got a few residencies here and there, but we played for peanuts most of the time. The most money we ever made was 25 quid a night on a Saturday night. We just totally copied the blueprint of the pub groups, most especially the Brinsleys. You have to have one kind of R&B song, one country song, a few songs you've written yourself, and it was totally nicked from that, A couple, and Dylan song or something. It was just a regular bar band, really. But the group that lurked behind all of this was the band. They were the holy grail of that scene, in my opinion. Certainly, in my mind, that was the music to aspire to be able to play. But you see, to me, they were like the ultimate rock and roll band.
Some rare BBC footage of Flip City, the group Elvis formed with his housemates, performing his song Exiles Road, which gave more than a passing nod to his heroes, the band. In summer 1976, two youthful veterans of the pub rock scene, Jake Riviera and Dave Robinson, unwittingly sparked a nationwide small label boom when they launched Stiff Records from a shopfront in Westbourne Grove. Their first release was So It Goes by former Brinsley Schwartz man Nick Lowe. Their cramped offices would soon overflow with audition tapes, but no one was quicker off the mark than Elvis, who had now flown Flip City to try for a solo career. Nick Lowe.
I was going up to the office and I met Elvis on Royal Oak Tube Station, and he had his guitar with him, and I said, how are you doing, blah, blah, blah. And he'd just been up to Stiff to buy a copy of Stiff 1 and to leave a tape with Jake Riviera. And I said, well, how are you getting on? And he told me this funny story about how he had this romantic notion about these old films, these old musical films that they used to make in the 40s, where guys would go to music publishers and bang out boy, have I got a song for you, and they'd bang out a song on the piano, and it would just so happen that the biggest star in the world would be in the room next door and would hear this song and come, running in and saying, that's just the ticket. And instead of sending tapes in to these people, these record companies and producers and things, he thought it would be a good idea to go in to their offices and take his guitar in with him and strum his stuff. Well, if anyone has ever been in the presence of Elvis when he's strumming his stuff face to face, one-on-one, it's not like he's just doing it very quietly and intimately. He belts it out as if he's playing on the Albert Hall or something. He just belts it out, and it's very intimidating. And especially in those days, the sort of mid-70s, no one did that kind of thing at all. So he wasn't getting very far. They just thought he was kind of bonkers, I suppose. So he wasn't getting very far. And he told me all this on the platform of the Royal Oak Tube Station. Anyway, we shook hands, and I wished him luck. And I went up to Stiff Records, and Jake Riviera was extremely excited and said, oh, this guy, that geeky Specs guy, has just been in and he's left this tape. It's really cool. And at the time, he said we should sign him as a writer. That's what his thoughts were, because he had one song called Mystery Dance, which Jake said, well, this would be great for Dave Edmonds, who at that time I'd just started working with. Romeo was restless, satisfied. Jake and I listened to the tape together, and then Jake said, no, we won't sign him as a writer. Let's sign him up as an actual performer, an artist. This kid's got something. So he signed him up, and because I was the Stiff house producer, basically because I'd just spent more time in the studio than anybody else that the other two people involved with Stiff that had spent in the studio. So I was wheeled in as the Stiff producer, and so it was my job to cut his first records with him. And the first two we cut were Mystery Dance and another one called, not Radio Sweetheart, it was a sort of little walking thing. Say one more for me. Yeah, that is Radio Sweetheart. I think that's what it was. Yes, it was.
Now a husband and father, Elvis was in a more precarious situation than ever, clinging to his day job as a computer programmer at Elizabeth Arden's cosmetics factory in Acton, but putting all his faith in Stiff Records. Jake Riviera.
Dave Robinson and myself were managing a group called Clover, who was signed to Phonogram, who couldn't get arrested. And because they had the time that they were sitting there with nothing to do, I sent him down to there. They lived at Headley Grange, and I sent him down there, and they learned up all his songs, and we cut the Miami's True album in 4 sessions. It was 2 days in the studio. It was 4 3-hour sessions to make that record. It cost £1,000. Out of the blue, they suggested this group Clover, who they'd brought over from America. Clover were this Marin County group who had 2 very, very obscure records that they'd made for Liberty. But they were incredibly versatile and were very, very good musicians. And they were somewhat at a loose end. They arrived in London at almost the worst time they could have possibly arrived in London, because the thing that was starting to happen in London, of course, was punk, and it was absolutely nothing to do with being able to play your instruments. It was down to attitude and style and, the directness of the whole thing. And American, hippies is what they looked like, just didn't fit in, and the fact that they could play and actually cared whether they played, rather than caring about what they were trying to put over, left them pretty, sort of like in the wrong time. So I got suddenly to rehearse with these guys who are just, they were not legendary, but they kind of had a mystique about them because people had talked about them, and that I knew anyway. And I went down, and they were living in some house out in the country where they'd been put up, which I don't know, they'd done some deal. I think it was the house where Led Zeppelin recorded. I used to sleep in the rehearsal room with all the gear, with the lights on, because if you put the lights off, the rats came out. That was the really thing, because I remember one night Dave Robinson came back from the pub, a little worse for wear, and he was sleeping on the other couch in the room, and he had stumbled in there and switched the light off, and then I woke up to the sound of this room full of rats. It's like, it's one of the more alarming parts of making the record.
Days off work, phoning in sick to rehearse at Headley Grange and then record at Pathway, a tiny 8-track studio in North London, where many of Stiff's early releases originated. Behind the console was Nick Lowe.
Punk rock was just starting, and I'd got this dodgy reputation really as a producer, and the people I was working with then were really quite a bit younger than me. I guess I was only in my 20s then, 26 or 27. But the people I was working with, I was a real old guy, the people I was working with all in their teens and very early 20s. As far as they were concerned, I was this real experienced old cove, But I didn't really know anything about anything, except that he gave off something that you could tell that he was somebody different. He didn't buy all my dodgy old jokes and things, and I used to cover up the fact that I didn't really know what I was doing, And for someone as young as he was then, to be so clear and in control of what they're trying to portray and get across, it's like an extremely maturity beyond his years. I was cutting the Damned records at that time, which were great records too, but in a different way. They were reckless and, full of abandon and things like that. But here was a guy, who was the same age as those guys, and was doing this, just a very mature and not a worn-out kind of thing, but just unsettling and very soulful beyond his years. I think that's what I'm trying to drive at.
Elvis was shrewd enough to realise that the energy of punk rock could give him a greater opportunity to make an impact. Accordingly, he made sure that his songs were infused with the appropriate attitude and sound for 1977.
What it mainly came down to was ignoring swing. It's actually something I had to relearn later on when I wanted to go into different kind of music. But the difference being, like Chuck Berry music, really the drummer is playing a swing feel, and he's playing that kind of which really kind of shifts along. But if you play it all in eighth notes down strokes, like, which is basically what punk does, with dun 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 dun, you get a really kind of rigid pulse, which it sounds kind of Nazi, you know, which is what a lot of punk has, that sort of slightly fascistic sound to it, you know. It really gets in your face, and that's all we did was just, but the songs just had a bit more tune. A lot of things off My Aim Is True have that grafted onto what would otherwise be much nicer songs, you know, underneath them. They're sort of nastied up a little bit by this attitude thing, in a way that, like, we weren't sort of emulating anything. It was all happening too quickly. It was just this thing of not wanting to sound stock.
Rather than try to modify his protégé's image, Jake Riviera was happy to celebrate Elvis's unconventional appearance, describing him in Stiff's first press release as baggy-suited and bespectacled, a Buddy Holly on acid. But he did suggest the name change.
I'd been working under the name, I'd taken my real initials, DP, and added them to my great-grandmother's name, Costello, or Costello, as I said it. And because it was much easier to use on the phone when I was trying to get bookings, and, you know, it looked better on bills and stuff than McManus, which is a hard, you know, the hard consonants at the ends there, it makes it hard to say. Jake Riviera or Dave Robinson, or maybe both of them, they would come at you like good cop, bad cop, you know, and sell the idea to you like that. This will be great, you know. And everything was, you know, heavily fueled. But there was a lot of Strongbow cider was being imbibed around there after hours, you know, and these mad plans would be hatched, and then they'd be all off the next day, you know. Then Jake just said, "Oh, we're going to call you Elvis," ha ha ha, you know, like, and I thought it was like another one of these things that would just pass off, you know, and of course it didn't. And then it kind of got a matter of honour, though, whether you could actually carry it off.
By a quirk of fate, the original Elvis happened to die just as the new Elvis was being launched, prompting the witty souls at Stiff to proclaim, "The king is dead, long live the king." It certainly seemed the time was right to go for it. Jake Riviera.
Once he'd made the album, I thought it was the dog's breakfast. And I said, you know, you've got to promote this. And he was willing to get, I said, you know, do you fancy chucking your job in? I think this could be really happening. And he was waiting to do that. And as soon as he got the chance, he left the vanity factory.
You're upstairs at the bar. A more conscious position of where I was in relation to what everything else was, you know. I thought that there's no point in me trying to pass myself off as some part of this scene, like part of this rebellion scene, which I always deeply suspected was scripted by Malcolm McLaren. And things were informing other groups very, very quickly. The smarter ones were actually able to come up with their own version of it, like The Clash. The dumber ones just copied it wholesale and looked ridiculous, you know. So I thought the best thing to do was to actually stay where I was, which was out in the suburbs, and take an outside view of everything.
This meant that Elvis wasn't too hidebound by punk convention, which allowed some of his more unfashionable influences to infiltrate the songs on his album. The most striking example was the impassioned ballad Alison.
The music that now has been, you know, devalued as being pub rock, I mean, the real music that those groups were all stealing from was a real rich kind of variety of stuff, and it wasn't just down to like country and New Orleans. You know, there was like Philly soul and stuff like that. Now, not all was done with the same polish as the real records, but I really was a big fan of the Detroit Spinners, and that was what that was. It was my Detroit Spinners song, and the whole chorus line, not the first part, the Allison bit, but the da 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 dee da da da, I know this world is killing you, is taken from Ghetto Child. Life ain't so easy when you... It's that kind of staccato thing. That's what it was. I mean, musically, that's what it was. I mean, you know, emotionally what it was is something else entirely. I can't really go into that.
Oh, it's so funny.
The day we cut Alison, that was the day when I thought, well, this is something seriously happening going on. That's undeniably a fantastic recording, a major artist, and it's a pretty awe-inspiring moment, actually. I don't mind admitting, I wept when I couldn't believe it, you know, but I actually like weeping sometimes, you know, it cheers me up sometimes. And especially when it's involuntary and you're rather embarrassed about it, I think it's rather a refreshing feeling when it comes on me. But when we did that, I thought, this really is something. I believe this.
Nick Lowe. As My Aim Is True eased its way into the album charts, Elvis set about assembling a group.
We had an advert in Melody Maker, I think, and held auditions. So you can't really audition on your own. So I borrowed the rhythm section from the Rumour, Andrew Bodner and Steve Golding, and they learnt like 3 of my songs, and we played them all day, and we got really bored playing them, you know. And the side effect of the whole thing was that as the day wore on, while we were waiting for somebody to show up, I taught Steve and Andrew from the Rumour, watching The Detectives, which I'd just written, because we were getting bored playing the same 3 songs all day. So we worked the arrangement out, and so we had a 4th song to play. And it sounded pretty good by the end of the day, so we went and recorded it like the next week. That was sort of the last independent record that I made as it were, solo artist, you know. I felt like that was the moment when I felt like it was onto something. Like, even though the first record had been very exciting to make, we'd really made a record that nobody else had made then, you know. The other things, you could kind of hear the joins from My Money. That's like, I regard that as my first real record.
Tibbs was the first to crack the top 20 in November 1977, by which time he was touring with his new group, The Attractions. Pete Thomas, who had played in the pub rock group Chilly Willy and the Red Hot Peppers, managed by Jake Riviera, was the undisputed choice as drummer, while auditions yielded the classically trained keyboard whiz Steve Naive, and on bass, a graduate of the Sutherland Brothers and Quiver, Bruce Thomas.
I rang up the ad in the Melody Maker to do the audition. I had half an idea who it was for. I heard what I presume was Elvis's voice in the background saying, "Ask him who he likes," and you know, and so it's, "Who do you like?" Which is the secretary who was in charge of the auditions, coordinating the auditions, who I subsequently married. So it was quite an auspicious phone call. Yeah, I wasn't really aware of what was going on with Joe Strummer in the pubs of West London and all that kind of stuff, you know. So when I said I like Steely Dan and Graham Parker, I heard that this voice in the background saying, "Whoa, dump him, get rid of him," and another voice off saying, "Oh, I think you should give him a chance, he sounds really nice." So I went out and bought Elvis's. He had a couple of singles out on Stiff, Red Shoes and Allison and so forth, and I spent a couple of days learning them. So that when I actually went to the audition, I pretended to learn these songs very, very quickly, which is very impressive, apart from the ones I'd never heard before, which I took a bit longer over, but more or less sort of muddled through it.
Since leaving Chilly Willy, drummer Pete Thomas had spent 2 years in California, playing laid-back country rock with singer-songwriter John Stewart, but he was now glad of an opportunity to come home and ride the new wave.
I'd clocked enough of what was going on to know that it was basically shiny suits and skinny ties. And when I was a kid, I would watch The Saint all the time. And it seemed like a golden opportunity to do a full sort of Roger Moore, you know, and get the skinny tie, the shiny suit, and the... So that's what I went for. It was probably not a very new wave, really, but, you know, I went straight out to Pasadena, you know, where you could still get all those fantastic old suits and things. And bought myself like a really good American shiny suit and got my hair cut. So when I came back to England, I already had all the gear, you know. So I was into it. It wasn't like Jake. In fact, Jake wanted me to dye my hair blonde, leave it long, dye it blonde, and call myself Pete Bond. That was his idea.
I didn't want a lead guitar player because, I mean, the Pistols had one, the Clash had one. All the groups had people who soloed, and I didn't want any solos. That was one of the things. I made 4 records before there was a guitar solo on it. There were guitar solos on the first record, but I didn't play any of them. So the idea was that I would just make a noise on the guitar, and it was immediate from getting Steve, who was such a good keyboard player, you know, and he'd been to the Royal College, and he could do things on the piano. We had a thing nobody else had. We had a really good piano player. Not a guy who could play a little bit, you know. Not a guy who could play with 2 fingers, but a guy who could really play. We had a bass player who could play melody, you know, whose strength wasn't really the rhythmic drive of a interlocking rhythm section, and a drummer who wanted to be Keith Moon. It seemed to be a pretty good balance of ages and experience and inexperience and naivety and cynicism, you know.
After a period of rehearsal and a few low-key club gigs, Elvis Costello and the Attractions zipped around Britain with the celebrated Live Stiffs Tour, a 60s-style package which showcased the Stiff label's new hopefuls. For a bunch of novices, sharing hotels and stages with Ian Dury and the Blockheads, Nick Lowe, Larry Wallace, and various other eccentrics was a fascinating and often startling introduction to the vagaries of rock and roll and life on the road. It certainly opened Elvis's eyes. Pete Thomas.
Yeah, well, of course it did, because it was like the first... Everyone had been playing in these funny little groups or out in the woods or in their bedrooms or anything, and that's the first thing that anybody gets out of the way once they get an element of success, unless they're completely bonkers. You know, that's the... You've just got to hope that you come through it, you know. I mean, but most groups, when they get success to start with, go and do all the... I don't know if they do now. Maybe they all just drink Perrier and things. But then, that was basically what you did when you got famous. Take loads of drugs and, you know, go cavorting about, carrying on alarmingly.
Most of the action went on in the audience when we toured on our own, because when we went on the road with a package tour, everything went on backstage and back at the hotel, you know. What's odd about it is all these people are on top of the pops, you know. I mean, these were pop people now. We were starting to become, in the next 6 months, we all became sort of some kind of pop star. So we weren't like rock and roll kind of animal kind of looking people. We looked fairly innocuous on the face of it. It was all just going on behind the scenes. And I really wasn't involved. I used to drink quite a bit of gin. That was about it, really. But there were some pretty wild scenes. But like I say, I don't want to glamorize it. It was sort of all a bit of a... on the one hand, it was sort of fascinating to me. On the other hand, it was slightly repellent. And all that came out of it, really, for me, was like writing a song like Pump It Up, which was sort of what it was about, a lot of the little scenes of it. But rather than write about them in a very reverential way, it was written about like as a whole, you know, as it flashed by you.
Evolution, Elvis and the Attractions were dissecting 60s groups as role models and influences. Among their early favourites were The Who, The Kinks, The Byrds, and particularly the Rolling Stones. Pete Thomas again.
Everyone was just chucking things in thick and fast, you know. And Elvis I remember we were in this little rooming house, and I was rooming with Elvis. And of course we got drunk all the time on cider, you know, we're all getting very excited. And one night I remember him saying that he wanted the album, which was this year's model, to sound like Aftermath, which was like my favourite album, you know. I just thought all the songs on it were great, you know, bit sexist but great. And I can remember leaping out of bed and punching the wall. You know, it just all seemed to be coming right, you know. Those are the sort of briefs, and it just all seemed to fall naturally into place. I mean, it's amazing how it did now. I mean, I think back on, like, Lipstick Vogue, you know. It was like, oh, I've got this song that goes like this. Great, I'll do drumming like this. And there wasn't any analysis. It was like, okay, fine, you know, and it just all seemed to happen really quickly. Sort of, I guess it was special, you know, the chemistry of it.
Lipstick Vogue from this year's model, recorded with the Attractions and again produced by Nick Lowe. Although he had a permanent group contributing musical ideas and a sympathetic producer, at the end of the day, it was Elvis who ran the show. Nick Lowe.
He definitely had the final say. Absolutely, all the way down the line, actually. Even though he'd always listened to what anybody had to say, but even in the face of massive objections in some cases, if he had a bee in his bonnet. For instance, I can remember him having ideas, especially for backing harmonies, for strange backing harmonies, and I'd try and talk him out of it, and he wouldn't have it. And eventually I'd say, all right, well, go ahead and do it. And I'd think smugly to myself, oh, well, he'll soon see this doesn't work, you know. And I'll record it, but he'll never remember. You know, when we come to mix it, I'll just leave it out, you know. And I'd try this on a couple of times, and he'd say, where's that funny backing vocal? And I go, ooh, 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 or something like that. And I'd say, well, here's something. You know, I wouldn't have listened to it for, you know, since it was done. I'd put it up, and he'd insist on it being there. And he'd be right. it was be really good. And so slowly I started backing out of my rather heavy-handed producer kind of role and start being more the sort of... I'd basically just sit there while he did the record and either approve or kind of raise an eyebrow, you know, and give him a sideways look, you know, if I didn't think it was going to work, which would register. But I can't say... can you boost the 2.8 on track 19 and 2.8 round about 3,000? You know, I tend to sort of go, can you make it go a bit more? You know, or it's going can you make it go or something like that? You know, I can do that kind of noise description stuff. So I was making sure that it was just all talking. The music was speaking to everybody, right? I was busy sort of waving my arms around, telling jokes, and a very, very important part of the process, I hasten to add.
The energy level, the excitement level, like from him turning up with the songs and then getting in the studio with Nick, it was incredible. I mean, I thought that's what recording was like, but I've never come across anything like it since. It was like a whirlwind in the studio, you know. It's like, go on then, do it again, do it faster, hit the drums as hard as you can, have another drink, you know. And Nick would just work it up into a frenzy through the day until by the time you got the track, you were playing stuff that you never even thought you could play, and Elvis would be singing like he never thought he could sing and playing guitar. You'd come and listen to it the next day and you just wouldn't even think it was you. It would be like, did we do that? You know, there'd be Nick waving his arms in there, yes, yes, come in and listen to it. You know, and he'd turn the volume up full and we'd all be pinned against the back wall, you know. And then, you know, he'd wait for 5 minutes and then, well, you can do it better than that, you bastards, you know, go on, get back out there. And just the way it was all like a whirlwind, you know, very, very exciting. Really was, you know. Come in and hear it, that was his big one. Come in and hear it, it's fantastic. You know, great. And he looked through the window and he's waving his arms in the air, you know.
Just before recording this year's model, Elvis and the Attractions had managed to squeeze in their first low-cost tour of America, flying in from the turmoil of British clubland, which was now resounding to the barbarous fury of groups like The Clash, The Damned and the Boomtown Rats. They were staggered by America's resistance to change.
We played the Whiskey a Go-Go, and the audience did consist of mainly sort of curious record industry people, junior record industry people at this stage, and twits in bin liners, you know, that had kind of seen a picture of, in some fashion magazine, of the styles from London, and they kind of like thought that we'd be really impressed if they turned up dressed like that, you know, girls in bin liners, really attractive. We were having a really hard job. I mean, the reviews we got from when we first went to America were really funny, you know. They said things like, we sounded like we formed on the plane. And they made up these great, like, meaningless cliches, like they suffer from cymbal-crashing ineptitude. America was disappointing because everywhere you went, you heard the same records. We were driving down the freeways, you know, of America, and turning the dial and getting the different parts of the same track on different stations, like Blue Bayou, the Roy Orbison song, was a big hit by Linda Ronstadt. You could hear different sections of the same song. That's how blanket the acceptance of the Eagles, Linda Ronstadt, Fleetwood Mac, Journey, Boston, Foreigner. And between that, you know, you had, like, I mean, Stairway to Heaven, which by this point had been out for like 5 years, was played every day on some stations still, you know, and it's about 2.5 hours long, you know. So, you know, it was hard for us to get our records on the radio, so inevitably we took against it. In England, it seemed to be much more like, let's keep everybody in their place kind of attitude. It seemed more sinister, really. So we went and did this radio, and that seemed like we'd done this terribly provocative thing, but I couldn't understand why. The song stated the bloody obvious. From the time we went on that Stiff tour, we didn't actually stop touring for 2.5 years. The only time we stopped touring was when we were in the studio. You know, we didn't actually take anything like a holiday, you know. That was for wimps.
BBC Radio 1FM series on Elvis Costello was presented by Nicky Campbell and co-written by Pete Frame and the series producer Kevin Howlett. Next week, part 2, Flat Down on the Accelerator.
It was just like you had your foot flat down on the accelerator, just guzzling life down, you know. It was tremendous, really, it was tremendous.
Do like a good guzzle. Thank you very much indeed. Great programme. This is BBC Radio 1FM at 3 o'clock.